Now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Jack Shonkoff, founding director of Harvard University Center on the Developing Child and co-editor of the groundbreaking report From Neurons to Neighborhoods, The Science of Early Childhood Development. He's going to tell us about how, what young children need and what happens if we fail to provide what they need to build a strong foundation for healthy and productive lives. So thank you again very much. I look forward to sharing the morning with you, and it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Shonkoff.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary Kanzler. I really, obviously, very much appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. I have to say that for those of us who work in the early childhood arena, kind of coming to North Carolina is like, you know, coming to holy ground, right? I mean, it's so. This is not an unsophisticated state when it comes to early childhood and understanding the knowledge base, because a good part of it's been generated here. So, but let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do with the time this morning. The title of the talk, Closing the Gap Between What We Know and What We Do. I take it as a given that since North Carolina has been one of the more important players in both generating what we know and demonstrating what we can do, that I think my purpose this morning is to really dig a little bit deeper into the science with you. You know, we're living in a very difficult political and economic context right now, and I'm not going to pretend to be able to talk about the political solutions for North Carolina. I think that's going to be a lot of the discussion during the day. But the science keeps moving. So this gap between what we know and what we do, which may be relatively more narrow here than in many other states, the danger that we have is that the gap is going to get greater again, not because we're not doing more, but because what we know is really moving very rapidly. And the science is pretty staggering, and I don't think we've seen anything yet. So let me tell you a little bit about where the science is and how we can think about the science, both reinforcing the answer to the why question, you know, why should we be focusing on early childhood, and then getting to the more challenging question, which is what should we do and how should we do it. So fortunately, for the sake of time, I don't have to really go through much of this slide because Secretary Kanzler already said what I would say with this. It's really important that we understand that when we think about child development, and particularly early childhood, it has to be in a broader context. This is not just about children, even though that would be enough. I think it would be enough to say, let's think about what we can do to improve children's lives because children deserve that. But if we want to look beyond that, it's not just a slogan, it's not a bumper sticker to say that child development is a foundation for economic productivity or responsible citizenship or sustainable communities, all of these things. It's really true. I mean, and everything that I'm going to say for the rest of my presentation is going to be grounded in science. There's nothing that I'm going to tell you that I couldn't be saying in front of a very kind of rigorous, unforgiving scientific audience and have people not sit there and say, well, you know, where did he make that up? So everything here is like rock solid science. It's the application that gets a little bit more nuanced, but the science is rock solid. And I would also say, since everything is being put now in the context of economic stimulus and economic productivity, is that there are probably two critical science-driven agendas that will determine the economic future of the country. One is the search for alternative energy sources, and the other is the search for mobilizing science to maximize human capital development. Without alternative energy and strong human capital, you know, we're not going to do very well in a global economy, and everybody knows that. That's why so much attention is being paid to this. But the problem is that we're in a tight resource environment, so how do we make wise choices? So what I'm going to do first is walk you through what the basic sciences, by that I mean neuroscience, molecular biology, genomics, an unbelievable revolution in biology that we're living through right now. What does that have to tell us that's relevant for early childhood? And probably the most important take-home message is that science is telling us that early life experiences are literally built into our bodies. I mean that literally. And what do I mean by that? So let me give you the crash course in neuroscience and genomics and molecular biology in English. So for starters, and some of this material many of you are already familiar with, this slide, which I'm going to add to in a moment, comes from a very often cited study by Hart and Risley on the development of expressive language in the first 3 years of life. So what they did, it's a relatively small sample study, but looked at 3 groups of children. Children who lived in families where mother was on public assistance and had not completed high school. Working class families where both parents were high school graduates but were low income, and families where parents were college educated and economically secure. And this is tracking over time the vocabulary that children demonstrated in the first 3 years of life. So what we see is up till about 16 months, there were no differences between the 3 groups. Not surprising, because 16-month-olds don't have really big vocabularies, okay, but they're just getting started. So if you follow the kids up to the age of 2, what we begin to see is that there's a little bit of differentiation between non-high school graduate families and high school graduate families, and a marked takeoff in the vocabulary of children who live in homes where parents are college educated and economically secure. And by the age of 3 years, children who live in families with college educated parents have about 3 times the vocabulary of children who live in families where the parents didn't graduate high school. And in the absence of intervention, that gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The important thing about this also is that this is not kind of genetically hardwired, because you can pretty much close that gap if you change the language environment in which kids are growing up. Because in the same study, people not only counted the words that the kids used, but counted the words that the mothers used in their daily interactions. And actually, the variation in the vocabulary of the 3-year-olds in the highly educated families exceeded the variation in the vocabulary of the mothers in the families where there was no high school education. This is the foundation for literacy. This is the foundation for educational achievement. It's the foundation for any kind of reasonable economic productivity in a global economy. And by age 3, we're already way behind and trying to catch up. Clearly, by age 2, we're already falling behind. So a public policy response that says, let's get in early and start at age 4 is kind of not really looking at what the science is telling us about when these gaps begin. Now, there are obviously political complications about this, but again, what I'm saying is this is just the facts, ma'am, just the facts, right? This is the science. The gap, and we've also known this for decades, that the gap in developmental test scores begins at about 18 months of age and increases over time. The data on this slide are from a study that was recently published last year by Administration for Children and Families in Washington, looking at the prevalence of developmental delays in children who were newly admitted to the child welfare system because of abuse or neglect. This is looking at the relationship between, on the x-axis, the number of risk factors. So it's the usual list: abuse, neglect, parental substance abuse, maternal depression, family exposure to family violence. And on the y-axis, it's the percent of children showing developmental delays at age 3. And what we find is that children coming into the protective service system with 3 or fewer risk factors had some modest prevalence of developmental delay. As the number of risk factors increases, you get to the point where when we're up to about 6 or 7 risk factors, it's virtually 90 to 100% of the children have delays in their development that make them eligible for Part C early intervention services in the delay category, this is not talking about at risk. This is talking about documented delays. And again, when we're measuring developmental progress and developmental delays from a kind of scientific point of view, from a biological point of view, we're assessing how the brain is doing. I mean, a developmental assessment is to brain function as a urine analysis is to the kidneys, right? I mean, it just tells us how the organ is working. And this pattern, by the way, of as the risk factors start to pile up, the poor outcomes begin to get greater, has been shown over and over again across the board for everything from IQ to broad-based developmental testing to a variety of health outcomes that I'm going to get to next. And this next slide comes from a large extended literature from a study conducted in California called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This was done in a middle-class population enrolled in the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system. It's a retrospective study, so it has those limitations, but basically this was thousands of middle-class people getting their health care in a very well-established HMO and getting retrospective history, asking them for histories in childhood of these adverse experiences, abuse, neglect, whether they were victims of abuse or neglect, lived in families with a substance abuse problem, or where there was family violence or serious family discord. And what we found was that for individuals who, in this particular slide is looking at the relationship between early adversity in childhood and the prevalence of heart disease in middle and late adult life. I mean, that's a long stretch, right? So what we found was that in this study, individuals with 2 or less adverse experiences had, about the same rate, or same risk of having heart disease later as the general population, odds ratio of 1 or a little bit above 1. As the number of risk factors increases, again, same old story, same old pattern, it's the cumulative burden of adversity on health and developmental outcomes. By the time you get to 7 or 8 of these risk factors, there was a 3-fold greater likelihood that you'd have heart disease when you were 50 or 60 years old, based on the degree of adversity you experienced in childhood. And this same pattern has been replicated with a wide range of diseases: diabetes, hypertension, stroke, several forms of cancer, serious depression, anxiety disorders, alcoholism, illegal drug use. I could put the same slide up. You see the same pattern over and over again. A modest amount of risk factors doesn't particularly add to greater health problems later, but when you start to pile up for larger numbers, you start seeing huge increases in the risk for physical and mental health problems. So if you kind of tie all these things together, there's one very clear message that's coming from a wide range of scientific sources, is that there's something about the pile-up of adversity early in life that affects the development of the brain, the immune system, the cardiovascular system, and a whole range of body organs. And the question is, what's that all about? And I will get to that in a few minutes. Okay. So what I want to do now is kind of shift from this broad sweep of impact of early adversity on long-term outcomes and zero in on the brain and give you your crash course in neuroscience about what have we learned over the last several decades, but particularly in the last 10 or 15 years. There's been an explosion of knowledge about how the brain develops, and particularly how the interaction between genetics and experience affects brain architecture. So what I want to do now is show you some data and present some concepts that represent state-of-the-art kind of mainstream thinking. This is not somebody did a study and somebody kind of ran with that study and tried to make a big case about it. This is the kind of the basic concepts that have come from years and years of work that tell us that early experiences literally affect the architecture of the developing brain. Okay, so core concepts of brain development. First of all, brains are built over time. That process begins in the prenatal period and it extends all the way through to adult life up until the time that you get that flat line on the EEG and people say, he's a great guy, really going to miss him. They pull the sheet up on the TV screen. Up until the moment before that, the brain is developing. How do we know that? Because every time you learn something new, some new connections are made in the brain. Synapses are created. Eric Kandel won a Nobel Prize for figuring that out, that the way memory and learning works in the brain, that every time you learn something new, the brain makes a new connection, a new synapse. And so what the brain is basically, it's an organ that's made up of billions and billions of cells and trillions of connections, synapses among those cells that form circuits. And the brain is basically a highly complicated, integrated mass of cells and very densely connected circuits. And that process starts during pregnancy. And at birth, the brain has most, not all, but most of the cells it's going to have for life. But it has relatively few of the connections. And it's the process of building those circuits that is the essence of brain development. A large part of that happens in the first years of life, and I'll show you that in a second, but it continues into adulthood. Now, what is it that shapes those circuits? Well, it's the interaction between genetic predispositions and experience that literally shapes the circuitry of the brain. The brain is kind of genetically programmed to take an experience and make circuits and build itself over time. And so there are some things that happen independent of major differences in experience. There are certain basic functions that are expected to happen, and the impact of experience is relatively limited. But everything that we care about related to learning, related to social interaction, emotional well-being, all that stuff is highly dependent on experience, okay? Because the brain is prepared to deal with lots of different experiences. Humans survive in lots of different cultures and lots of different environments. So the brain is waiting for those experiences to shape its circuitry. Unfortunately, the capacity for change decreases with age. This is the concept of plasticity that neuroscientists talk about. When it's young and immature, the brain has maximum capacity to adapt and change. And as it gets more mature, as its circuitry gets more developed and gets stabilized, it's harder to change. Not impossible to change, but harder to change. So, it's not January anymore, so it's a distant memory. It's February, but it's a good time of the year. New Year's resolutions is our kind of cultural example of the difficulty of the brain being able to change over time. We make the same resolutions every year. It's kind of hard to do them, not because we don't have willpower, but because it's much harder for the brain to change patterns as they get established.